It goes without saying that California is the largest state in the nation. However, its political history has many twists and turns, which makes it one of the most fascinating states to study. From the early days of statehood, with Southern conservatives dominating the political landscape, to the ever changing business climate, which led to epic battles between pro and anti monopoly candidates, to the exclusion of Chinese and Japanese Americans from the political landscape, to Nixon and Reagan conservatism, and the liberal dominance that we know today, California's electoral path is far from linear. I hope that you will join me on this adventure through one of the most difficult states to understand, that being the great and extremely large state of California. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Election History. My name is Dave, and I make videos about campaigns, elections, candidates, political parties, and the likes. If this is the type of content you like, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button to help this channel in the algorithm. You can also join my Patreon as well. If you'd like to join my Patreon, the link is down in the description below. Before we get into this video, I want to preface it by saying that this is a brief view at the electoral history of the state of California, and easily the most complex state that I have done so far. This topic alone could have an entire channel dedicated to it. But as with these state-centered videos, I mostly hope that you come out of the video knowing a little bit more about California's electoral history than you did when you started. Now, let's delve into the video. California is easily one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse, states in the Union. Originally, the lands that were to eventually become the state of California were dominated by agriculture. From traditional wheat and corn to other crops such as grapes and cotton, California quickly emerged as an agricultural leader. This would lead to many from the American South who were pro-slavery and supported the expansion of slavery into California to find their way into the American West. And with California's vast forests, forestry became a growing industry for the region's pioneers. After the Mexican-American War, resources which needed to be mined were being discovered, bringing prospectors who staked their claim to hit it rich in the gold trade, as well as large mining companies looking to mine copper, iron, and other resources, which brought more workers, mostly from the East Coast and the Midwest, into the state. The natural resource extraction business would further be expanded with the discovery of oil, which became more important as America, quite late, moved into the Industrial Revolution. With the expansion of industrialization, the banking industry also found its foothold, with the Bank of America being founded in 1904 in San Francisco, making California a newly emerging economic hub. Before and during World War II, California also became a military hub, with the Sierra Nevadas and other mountain ranges, along with the high coastal cliffs, being a natural barrier to an ever-increasing threat from the Empire of Japan. Once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, much of America's military-industrial complex shifted their operations to California. And just prior to the war, film companies, which were looking for locations that were not just geologically diverse, but also allowed for filming year-round, found many in their profession flocking to the Los Angeles area. While there are many more industries that I haven't mentioned, we can see that the economic interests in California were not just dominated by one interest. This is what led to what political scientist Totten J. Anderson calls an atypical and unorthodox political system in California. The reason that I lead with talking about the economic diversity of California is because it gives you a bit of a background when considering the electoral history of the state. Unlike some other territorial states that I've discussed, like Alaska and Arizona, California has a very short interim government period and nearly went immediately into statehood after the Mexican-American War. Because of the migration of Southern Democrats to California before the discovery of gold, California's partisan leaning was strongly Democratic. But as political scientist Taunton Anderson states, many of the voters who were in California at the time identified as Democrats, which was probably more due to a cultural connection to the party's affiliation with the American South more than it was an endorsement of Southern political ideology. However, even if these new migrants from the American South were benign on the issue of slavery, many of them still held white supremacist views. In fact, many of these farmers benefited from lands that expelled Native Americans from their lands. John C. Fremont, who was the military governor of California as well as the first Republican nominee for president in 1856, was highly involved in what was known as the California Genocide, which ethnically cleansed between 2,000 and 16,000 Native Americans, as well as the displacement of over 100,000 Native Americans. This made it a lot easier for Americans of European descent to take control of the lands and financially benefiting. And yes, Fremont was anti slavery, which just goes to show that you can't judge a book by its cover. With this backdrop, it probably isn't a surprise that the Democratic Party dominated the very early days of electoral politics. The state's first election was for governor in 1849, when Democrat Peter Hardeman Burnett was elected with nearly 48% of the vote in a four-way race. Interestingly, Burnett, who was born in Nashville, Tennessee, and raised in Missouri, was from a slave owning family, supported slavery, and was a white supremacist. He would sign into law the ironically named Act of the Government and Protection of Indians of 1850, which enslaved Native Americans in California. This further exacerbated the California genocide that I mentioned earlier. Even though Burnett had been elected governor of the state of California, it still wasn't officially a state. That wouldn't come until the Compromise of 1850, which admitted California as a free state into the Union, which also allowed for the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. California's Constitution in 1849 banned slavery, which helped it to be admitted into the Union, but sources conflict as to whether they banned slavery because they truly opposed slavery or because it would make it easier for them to be admitted into the Union. Regardless, California was now a state and a free state at that. In fact, the appointment of John C. Freeman, an anti slavery Democrat, and William M. Gwin, a pro slavery Democrat, as their U.S. senators in Washington showed just how difficult the slavery issue was, even though the state was admitted as a free state. However, Fremont's days as a U.S. Senator wouldn't last for long, in fact, only 175 days. Democrats in the California State Assembly rallied against Fremont as a result of his votes in the Senate being seen as anti-slavery. Those particularly opposed to Fremont were the Shivs, a group of pro-slavery Democrats who had electoral support from the California Rancheros in Southern California, who essentially used Native American slave labor to tend their fields. He was removed from the U.S. Senate on March 3rd, 1851, and wouldn't be replaced until January 30th, 1852, with pro-Chivs candidate John B. Weller. While governor, Burnett led California off a fiscal cliff. Without the support of an overwhelming majority of the party, Burnett resigned as governor on January 9th, 1851, and would be replaced by Lieutenant Governor John McDougall. While McDougall would probably not be considered pro-slavery, he didn't necessarily oppose slavery, as much of his support would come from those who strongly supported slavery. But for his first election as governor, this wasn't enough. McDougall was replaced by John Bigler, who was a hardline Democrat on the issue of slavery, which won him the support of Southern Democrats at the Democratic Convention. Not only did he seek the support of Southern Democrats, he also supported restricting immigration of labor from China, as well as the continued suppression of Native Americans. He even went as far as issuing state of California bonds to pay for so-called expeditions against the Indians. John Bigler would barely win the 1851 election, winning by less than 1% to Pearson B. Reading, the Whig candidate who was also seen as pro-slavery. But with the slavery issue set aside, Bigler was somewhat credited for the rapid industrialization of California during his tenure as governor. So let's recap here. After being admitted to the Union as an anti slavery state in 1850, by 1852, California had two pro slavery senators, a pro slavery governor, and a legislature highly influenced by Southern Democrats. And if there were any anti slavery Democrats like Fremont, they usually had no problem with the genocide of Native Americans. Okay, let's continue. Bigler's reelection was close yet again, but this time against William Waldo. But things were starting to change. As more migrants came from northern states, Southern identity, which the issue of slavery was part of, was becoming less salient in California Democratic politics. The Whig Party decided not to include the issue of slavery in their California platform so that they would win over the increasing number of Northern anti slavery Democrats entering the state. It's also at this time that you start seeing some of the geographical splits in the state. Areas where agriculture and gold mining were prominent still had large numbers of Southern Democrats and thus voted Democratic. The other industries that started bringing Northerners into the state, such as banking, forestry, and other mining efforts, were more supportive of the Whig Party and focused around Los Angeles and San Francisco counties, which were not nearly as important in the state as they are today. Even though I keep mentioning slavery, I've also talked about nativism within the Democratic Party, such as the treatment of the Chinese and Native Americans. The slavery issue had influence with Democrats from the American South, but was actually a non issue in California because it was a free state. It was basically a vote getting issue. But so was nativism, and Governor Bigler easily cornered the market on that. Or did he? It seems like the way to defeat Bigler was to out nativism him. With that, we have the arrival of the American Party, or the Know Nothings, on the political scene. I'm not going to get into the Know Nothings except to say that their party was highly focused on nativism and the threat of immigrants coming to California. If you want to know more about the Know Nothings, I highly recommend watching Sean Munger's recent video about Millard Fillmore. In the 1855 election, Bigler ran against American Party candidate J. Neely Johnson, with Johnson winning a close election against Bigler. The Know Nothings also took control of the state assembly and the state senate. But according to Peyton Hurt, the Know Nothings didn't do anything to push nativist agendas in California, with many members of the party seeing it as a temporary opposition to the Democrats. Still, those diehard voters and those within the American Party itself didn't like that Johnson was so ineffective in pushing their agenda. He was not renominated as their candidate in 1857 and was replaced by George Washington Bowie, who finished third behind Democrat John B. Weller and Edward Stanley, a candidate from the newly formed Republican Party whose political base was in San Francisco. Yes, the county that gave Democrat Gavin Newsom the highest percentage of the vote in 2022 gave the Republican Party candidate in 1857 the highest percentage of votes. I also just want to mention the 1856 presidential election here. Democrat James Buchanan won 48% of the vote in California, with former president and Know Nothing candidate Millard Fillmore winning 33%. Former California Senator John C. Freeman, now running under the banner of the newly formed Republican Party, only received 19% of the vote. California was Fremont's third worst state of those that had him on the ballot. You might remember Weller as the Shiv's choice as U.S. Senator to replace John C. Fremont. With the looming Civil War, Weller campaigned on making California an independent republic if the United States split into a North and a South. And while he was sympathetic to the pro-Southern faction in the Democratic Party, he didn't talk about slavery as much. However, he was a major contributor to the continued California genocide, paying Walter S. Jarboe and his men to carry out killings of the Yuki tribe. He also continued with the nativist policies of his Democratic predecessors. The irony of it was that the least nativist governor that California had up until this time was probably J. Neely Johnson, the Know Nothing governor. The political landscape was shifting as more people moved to the states. One person who was appointed to the US Senate was David Broderick, who essentially was a Tammany Hall style boss of San Francisco. This influence in the ever growing county led him to having strong influence in the state legislature. However, he was a supporter of the Free Soil movement, which was a prominent anti slavery movement at the time. One of those who strongly opposed the Free Soil movement was David S. Terry, the former Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, who failed to get the Democratic nomination for the 1859 election. He blamed Broderick's Free Soil influence in the Democratic Party as for the reason for his defeat at the convention. As a result, Terry challenged Broderick to a duel, which Broderick lost and died 3 days later. He would become seen as a martyr for the abolitionist cause. The 1859 gubernatorial election showed the next big cleavage in California politics, especially on the Democratic side. By 1859, the majority of Democrats had supported the abolition of slavery. This led to those who were pro Southern and pro slavery to break away from the Democratic Party. While they still called themselves Democrats, they were essentially known as Lecompton Democrats, as they supported the pro slavery Lecompton Constitution in Kansas. The Democratic candidate was attorney John Curry, the Lecompton candidate was former Congressman Milton Latham, and the Republican candidate was Leland Stanford. Yes, he and his wife were the founders of Stanford University. Even with the support for abolition in the Democratic Party, Latham would win 59% of the votes, the most votes for any candidate up to that time. But immediately after being elected governor, he wanted to be a senator. And yes, I mean immediately. He only served as governor for 6 days. Remember, former Senator David Broderick was dead and replaced by Henry Hahn. Hahn was only to be a temporary replacement until the legislature elected a new senator. Well, Latham was that man. And no, he isn't even the shortest serving elected governor. That would be Hiram Bingham III of Connecticut, only serving 1 day after being elected. Now we've come to the presidential election of 1860. While Abraham Lincoln won California's 4 electoral votes, he barely did so. Lincoln won 32.3% of the vote, which was the lowest percentage of any of the states that Lincoln won. Democrat Stephen A. Douglas only lost California by 709 votes. But even more noticeable was John Breckinridge, the Southern Democrats' candidate for president, who won 28.3% of the votes. In the end, Lincoln benefited from the split in the Democratic votes. The governor at the time was John Downey, who had been a Lecompton Democrat, but switched over to being an anti Lecompton Democrat after the war started. And this wasn't uncommon. In fact, it was at this point where historians argue that many of the Lecompton Democrats who came from the North were not really supporters of slavery and only supported the Lecompton Constitution for political expediency. Downey himself was born in Ireland and eventually immigrated to Ohio before ending up in California. The switch ended up dooming Downey's chances for renomination, mainly because of a split in the Democratic Party. John R. McConnell ran as a Breckinridge Democrat, supporting the Lecompton Constitution, with John Conness running as a Union Democrat, supporting more liberal views on immigration, especially those from China, as well as being anti slavery, as he was closely associated with the abolitionist hero David Broderick. Both, however, would lose to Leland Stanford, the Republican candidate for governor. Of course, Stanford opposed slavery. And even though he repealed the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, he continued to conduct military operations against indigenous tribes. He was also very racist, considering both blacks and Asians as inferior. While he said that he did not want blacks or Chinese in California, he still used Chinese workers to build his railroad. But earlier that year, the appointment for the U.S. Senator from California was even more wild. The California legislature met on March 9, 1861, to start the process of selecting a senator. To put this in context, this was after the Confederate States of America were formed, but before the hostilities that would start the American Civil War. There were a lot of candidates in the race. First, we have James McDougal, who was an anti Lecompton Democrat and former Attorney General of Illinois. John Nugent and James W. Denver represented the Lecompton Democrats. However, those Democrats who supported the South backed a number of candidates, with the most prominent being former Governor John Weller. The Republicans also had a candidate, Timothy Phelps, who was a member of the California Senate. The first ballot had McDougal and Weller tied at 27 votes, with Phelps third at 23 votes. 57 votes were needed to be appointed to the U.S. Senate. As the votes continued, it seemed as if it would always be in a deadlock. But on the 19th ballot, the Lecompton Democrats consolidated their votes behind San Francisco Herald owner John Nugent, with Breckenridge Democrats also switching over to Nugent, with Weller now a distant fourth. However, on the last ballot, Republican and Constitutional Union supporters threw their support behind McDougal, giving him the win on April 2nd. Originally, it was assumed that McDougal won on March 20th, but there was a miscount that caused an error requiring the last vote to be on April 2nd. If you would like to read the entire debate during the Senate debate, which is nearly 1,000 pages long, it's down in the description. Knock yourself out. Now, there is something I want to mention before we continue. Since California was a new state, many of those who ran for public office in California had no roots in the state. Therefore, in the early days, you see many who had held office previously in another state, like James McDougal. California almost became a vagabond destination for those looking to restart a political career. It wasn't unheard of at all to see someone run for statewide office who had only lived there for a short amount of time, lose, then return to where they came from. I haven't mentioned this because there are way too many politicians in California who did this in the early days of statehood. 1 year after Stanford was elected governor and the Civil War was now in full swing, being a Democrat who supported the South was politically reckless. But being a Democrat in general wasn't good either. Essentially, Democratic candidates only received the votes of Southerners and nobody else. In 1862, Republicans, also known as the Union candidates, dominated legislative elections, winning a supermajority in each chamber. This resulted in John Conness now being appointed to the U.S. Senate in 1863, and later Cornelius Cole in 1865, after the Civil War had already ended. As far as the 1863 election for governor, Frederick Lowe would defeat former Governor John Downey by 18%, continuing Republican dominance in the state. After the Civil War was over, two issues were gone: slavery and support of the Union. Now attention turned to corruption and monopolies, particularly in the railroad industry. For the National Union candidates, who were essentially the Republicans, this was a huge problem. One candidate running for governor in 1867, which was the first post-war election as well as the first election for a 4 instead of 2-year term, was John Bidwell. Bidwell opposed the monopoly that the Central Pacific Railroad had on rail in California, as he argued that it manipulated markets and controlled the rates of freight instead of letting the free market determine the price. Bidwell's politics could be seen as the birth of the progressive politics era in California. He ran for the National Union nomination in 1867, but was defeated by George Cogden Gorham, who was one of the owners of the Central Pacific Railroad. Gorham took on Henry Huntley Haight, the Democratic candidate. According to the Sacramento Bee, quote, "If Haight is really elected, his success is due wholly to the determination of the masses of the Union Party to rebuke an immoral system of party management, and to break down a corrupt combination of schemers and demagogues which threaten to alienate valuable public property wrongly and to impose extra burdens on taxpayers for the benefit of speculators." End quote. Haight won the election by over 10%. While we might think of Haight as the fun loving hippie corner of Haight Ashbury, which is located in a precinct that voted for Kamala Harris with 93% of the votes, the governor that the street is named after was basically a racist, keeping in tradition with the previous California governors. During his inauguration speech, Haight said that Reconstruction of the South, quote, disenfranchised enough white men to give the political control to a mass of Negroes just emancipated and almost as ignorant of political duties as the beasts of the field. End quote. And throughout his term, he would continue to say things along the same lines. 2 years later, in 1869, the Democrats won both chambers of the legislature, which allowed them to nominate Eugene Casserly as the Democratic U.S. Senator. However, Haight's time as governor would only last one term, losing Republican Newton Booth in 1871. Booth's win also helped legislative Republicans, who took control of the state assembly as well as gaining 5 seats in the state Senate. This would lead to the Republicans nominating Aaron Augustus Sargent, another Republican who had strong ties to the railroad industry. Both Booth and Sargent showed the problem that existed in the party. Booth, like Bidwell before him, was anti monopoly, while Sargent was the opposite. In 1873, the economic panic of 1873 led to a backlash against Republicans who had ties to the railway companies. As a result, there was a split in the Republican Party, with the People's Independent Party forming, which was a strongly anti monopoly party. The party won a plurality of the seats in the state assembly and controlled the balance of power in the state Senate. Senator Casserly resigned from the U.S. Senate and was replaced by John Hager, an anti monopoly Democrat, to fill out the rest of Casserly's term. When the term expired, Governor Newton Booth was appointed U.S. Senator by the legislature, now under the banner of the Anti Monopoly Party. The 1875 gubernatorial election saw a widening of the political cleavage in the Republican Party. Along with the anti monopoly issue, which still divided Republicans, the issues of prohibition also started to split the party. The Republican Party was seen as a party that supported the sale of alcohol, and Bidwell was a strong supporter of prohibition. Therefore, he ran as an independent candidate under the People's Independent Party banner. The Republicans nominated Timothy Guy Phelps, who you might remember from that crazy Senate vote on the eve of the outbreak of the Civil War. With Bidwell being seen as a radical on business and prohibition and Phelps as the status quo pro-monopoly candidate, Democrat William Irwin was seen as the moderate choice between the two. Irwin was elected in 1875 with 50.03% of the vote. Throughout the rest of the 1870s and 1880s, political power was determined based on views towards monopolies. Being anti-monopoly was considered a winning issue and led to Democrat William Irwin, Republican George C. Perkins, and Democrat George Stoneman being elected as governor. But in the late 1870s, another issue started to gain prominence, which was discrimination against Chinese and Chinese Americans. Throughout this video, I've mentioned the poor treatment of Chinese residents in California before, but it became more front and center after the Panic of 1873. A large number of those in the anti-monopoly movement blamed immigrants from China for the worsening economic conditions in California. This movement formed in what became the Working Men's Party of California. While the name might be seen as a pro-worker and socialist movement, which was starting to gain traction in the United States, in reality, it was nothing more than a thinly veiled anti-Chinese organization that sought to not only stop immigration of Chinese into California, but also do what they could to remove Chinese from the state. Even though racism against Chinese was part of the Working Man's Party's platform, there were two distinct factions within the party, one focused on racism and one focused on labor. The racist faction of the party was led by Dennis Kearney, an Irish immigrant who blamed Chinese immigrants for the economic hardships of the white man. Then you had the pure labor faction, with people like William F. White being part of its ranks. For those who were starting to look at socialism as a political alternative to capitalism, there was no room for them in either the Democratic or Republican parties. Therefore, they found themselves in the Working Men's Party. Now, it should be noted that there was a National Working Men's Party which lasted just a little over a year and which dissolved just a few months before the Working Men's Party of California was formed. Many early members of the National Party in California were pure socialists. When the California branch started and fired up the anti Chinese rhetoric, many in the National Party, as well as those who identified with the National Party who lived in California, renounced the California faction of the movement. The National Party would merge with other organizations to form the Socialist Labor Party of America in December of 1877, while the Working Men's Party of California, which started only a little over 2 months prior, would continue until 1881. The Working Men's Party did have some success and impacted California politics. In 1877, the party elected one member to the California Assembly and one to the California Senate. 2 years later, the party won 10 seats in the state Senate, making it the second largest party in that chamber behind the Republicans, and 16 in the Assembly, just two behind the Democrats, but not enough to control the balance of power. The working men's candidate for governor was William F. White, with many anti monopoly Democrats voting for White. After the election, he was picked as banking commissioner by outgoing Governor Irwin and became a Democrat yet again. After the election of 1879, the party started to dissolve, which was for two reasons. First, the party was debating whether it should stand alone as an independent party or team up with the Democratic Party or affiliate themselves with the Greenback Labor Party, the precursor of the late 19th century People's Party or Populists. This disagreement alone led to the dissolution of the party. But another thing led to the party's dissolution, with their demise actually being a result of their success. The issue of Chinese exclusion from immigration to the United States had been picking up steam in Washington, D.C., particularly by Horace Francis Page, a Republican congressman from San Francisco. Page was, without a doubt, a white supremacist and felt that non-white races, particularly Chinese, were inferior. While in Congress, he introduced H.R. 5804, which would eventually be known as the Chinese Exclusion Act. This act would severely restrict Chinese immigration to the United States. Some made the argument that this restricted cheap labor coming into the United States, which was something that the anti-monopoly politicians had been arguing for years. Others purely said that it was racial. In fact, when debated in Congress, the white supremacist approach was taken by Page in order to win Southern Democrats over to his side. It worked with all Southerners in Congress, with the exception of William Robert Moore of Tennessee, who was Republican, voting for the Chinese Exclusion Act. Even though the Chinese Exclusion Act had passed, the issue of Chinese immigration, especially those who were still in California, was still an issue that moved voters. Charles C. O'Donnell, an independent who won 6.3% of the vote in a race for governor in 1886, ran a campaign exclusively on removing Chinese from California. But even though it was a salient issue to some voters, it was still the anti-monopoly sentiment that pushed voters in one direction or another. In the elections for governor in 1886, 1890, and 1894, the candidate who was seen as being more anti-rail monopoly were usually the winners. Oh, and I really haven't mentioned the U.S. senators as of late, even though there were some big names like Leland Stanford and George Hearst, the patriarch of the Hearst dynasty. The main reason was that the legislature still selected senators, and it was mostly the most powerful men in California that received these positions. While the gubernatorial candidate had to campaign on being anti-monopoly, it didn't matter if the U.S. senators were, as the legislature never really cared. And speaking of the legislature, the Republicans gained control of both chambers in 1890. In 1892, the Democrats would regain the state assembly, but then lost control in 1894. The Democrats would not regain control of the state assembly again until the 1936 election and the state senate until the 1956 election. The 1889 campaign is where we really see a change in the anti monopoly vote. With socialism and communism on the rise worldwide, those who were being connected with anti monopoly movements were now being labeled as communists and socialists by those who were pro monopoly. Democratic Governor James Budd did not seek re election due to illness. James McGuire, the eventual Democratic nominee for governor, had the support of the People's Party, a left wing populist movement which supported collectivism in both industry and agriculture, as well as the Silver Republicans, who basically supported the same thing but opposed the Republican Party's support for the gold standard. The Republican nominee was Henry Gage, who supported the Southern Pacific Railroad. Not only did Gage and his supporters call McGuire a socialist and communist, but also anti Catholic, though he was a Catholic himself. There was a book that he had written 10 years earlier, which he argued that there was collaboration between the British Crown and medieval popes to control Ireland. This led to a number of Catholic priests, as well as San Francisco's Archbishop, to denounce McGuire. And while I haven't mentioned it with the exception of Dennis Kearney of the Working Men's Party, many in California, as well as a number of elected officials in the states, were Irish immigrants. McGuire lost to Gage by 6.7%, with James Budd being the last Democrat to serve as governor until Colbert Olson won in 1938. The Republicans dominated California politics for the next 12 years, but it might not be as dominant as people think. While the Republicans did do well in local and legislative elections, the elections for governor were usually won because a third party candidate was taking away votes from the Democrats. In 1902, Democrat Franklin Knight Lane lost to George Party by less than 1%, with socialist candidate Gideon Brower winning 3.2%, which would have likely gone to the Democratic candidate if Brower wasn't in the race. In 1906, Democrat Theodore Arlington Bell lost to James Gillett by less than 3%, with the Independent Party, funded by William Randolph Hearst, taking 14.4% and the Socialist having 5.1%. Again, these votes would have likely gone to the Democratic candidates, especially since the Independent Party's platform was similar to that of the Democrats. While the Republicans were dominating, there was about to be a shift in the party. While both Pardee and Gillett were strongly supported by the railroads and big business, there was still a strong progressive movement in the Republican Party. This would eventually lead to the creation of the Lincoln-Roosevelt League, an organization within Republican Party politics in California to fight against the influence of the Southern Pacific Railroad in California politics, a company that I've already mentioned numerous times before. This organization essentially became one of the catalysts of what would be the progressive movement nationally, led by Teddy Roosevelt. You can watch more about that in this video here, so I'm not going to get into details about that movement. Suffice to say, sentiment against the railroads, specifically the Southern Pacific Railroad, was growing quite rapidly in the party. The candidate that emerged as the favorite amongst the Lincoln-Roosevelt League for governor was Hiram Johnson, a prosecutor from San Francisco who led successful prosecutions against some of the highest profile corruption cases in the state. Johnson ran against George Alexander and Nathan Ellery Spaulding, both conservatives and supporters of business interests. But unlike in the past, where the party convention determined a nomination, voters now decided the nominee in the primary election. The primaries were closed, which required voters to register with a political party. Johnson would go on to win the Republican primary with 46% of the votes to Alexander's 25% and Spaulding's 21%. Around 9% went to other minor candidates. Johnson would defeat Theodore Arlington Bell by 5.8% in the general election. With the split in the Republican Party nationally and former President Teddy Roosevelt taking on incumbent William Howard Taft, Johnson, who was one of the highest profile progressives in the nation, became Roosevelt's running mate with the Bull Moose Party in 1912. Again, I'm not going to delve into that. I already have a video about that. Roosevelt won California in the presidential election, but lost the election to Democrat Woodrow Wilson. Johnson returned to California and ran for re-election as governor 2 years later under the progressive ticket. He easily won, defeating the Republican candidate John Fredericks by over 20%. The Progressives also won the treasurer's race, as well as 9 seats in the state Senate and 28 seats in the state Assembly. Even though the Republicans still had the most seats, the Progressives worked with the Democrats to elect Frank Combs, a progressive, as Speaker of the California State Assembly. Now we've also come to the point where U.S. senators were democratically elected by popular vote. Former mayor of San Francisco, Democrat James D. Fallon, beat a progressive Republican and Socialist Party candidate. Though he was a Democrat, he was also considered reform minded and would eventually support Wilson's new freedom agenda. Again, I talk about that in this video. Even though the politics of California were dominated by progressives, racism against Asians was still a problem. Almost all the candidates that I mentioned were either strongly anti-Chinese or supported legislation that would restrict Chinese immigration or rights in general. But as the turn of the century came, it wasn't just Chinese that were targeted, but the growing number of Japanese entering California. One of the leaders of this movement was newly elected Senator James D. Pellin, who opposed Asians entering California and was an enthusiastic supporter of removing Asians from the states. Hiram Johnson, in his first term as governor, signed the California Alien Land Law of 1913, which prevented those who could not get citizenship from owning land. So yes, it does have to be recognized that the progressive movement in the early part of the 20th century did have a racism problem, regardless of party. Midway through his second term, Johnson ran for the U.S. Senate and won 61.1% of the vote with the backing of progressives. Johnson would hold that Senate seat until his death in 1946, never receiving under 60% of the vote. Interestingly, in 1922, author Upton Sinclair ran against Johnson as the socialist candidate, but only received 6.3% of the vote. Johnson, along with a number of other Republicans, made amends with the Republican Party establishment and ran on the Republican ticket. However, he was also the progressive candidate as well in what is known as a fusion ticket. Places like New York State still have fusion tickets today. His replacement as governor was William Stevens, who won his own full term in 1918. In 1920, Phelan ran for re-election based on anti-Japanese fears and nothing more. His opponent, Samuel Shortridge, also campaigned on anti-Japanese fears, but also benefited from a Republican national wave in 1920. Shortridge won by over 8% and won re-election with 63.1% of the votes in 1926. Republicans dominated California politics in the 1920s and most of the 1930s. Governor Friend Richardson, who won in 1922, rolled back many of the reforms that progressives had instituted. His successor, C.C. Young, was a progressive and tried to improve on previous progressive legislative gains. But by this time, the legislature was purely filled with big business Republicans. Big business got their man in 1930 with the election of James Rolfe, the longest-serving mayor of San Francisco. But he died at the end of his term and was replaced by Frank Merriam, another strong big business anti-labor Republican. Merriam is probably most known for his hard-handed approach to dealing with the longshoresman strike of 1934, which not only became quite violent, but had a devastating impact on the price of goods being imported. He blamed the strikers for California's economic woes. As a result, he was able to win re-election over Upton Sinclair, now the Democratic nominee for governor. Raymond L. Haight, the cousin of the former governor, ran as a progressive, winning 13%. However, the Democrats finally won something. In the U.S. Senate, Shortridge didn't run for re-election, instead deciding to work in Washington. William Gibbs McAdoo was the Democratic nominee for the Senate, former Secretary of the Treasury and son-in-law of former President Woodrow Wilson. And yes, while he was considered a progressive by Wilsonian standards, He was for prohibition, received support from the Ku Klux Klan, strongly opposed segregation, and thus supported the continued exclusion of Chinese and Japanese from California and the nation as a whole. Before we continue, you might have noticed that I didn't mention an important California politician, which was President Herbert Hoover. The reason why is that Hoover really wasn't involved with California politics. Yes, he was from California, but that was about the extent of his political connection to California. Almost everything that he did was in regard to working with the federal government. But I know people might wonder why I'm not talking about Hoover, and that's why. The 1938 election saw the Democratic Party make some small gains. 2 years before, in 1936, Democrats took control of the state assembly. Up until this time, California was mixed on Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, with Hiram Johnson mostly supporting the New Deal legislation. But now it was more supportive of the New Deal than it had been in the past. As a result, Colbert Olson, a Democrat and strong supporter of the New Deal, defeated incumbent Frank Merriam by over 8%. In the U.S. Senate, Sheridan Downey, who was also a strong New Deal supporter, defeated incumbent Senator McAdoo in the Democratic primary and eventually won the general election. Once elected, Downey became more conservative and supported big business interests, with oil and not the railroads now being the new political power in California politics. As for Olson, the first atheist governor of any state, he tried to pass more progressive reforms, but was usually stopped by the more conservative members of his own party. And if you're wondering, both Olson and Downey supported the internment of Japanese Americans after the outbreak of World War II. So, yeah, some things really don't change. Olson would only serve as governor for one term, losing to California's popular Republican Attorney General Earl Warren, who was also a supporter of the internment of Japanese Americans as Attorney General, as well as the continuation of land confiscation programs against Asians. Later, he would say that he had regrets for his involvement and said that he was wrong for supporting the policy, but never publicly apologized for his involvement. Still, when he ran for Attorney General in 1938, he was the nominee for the Republicans, the Progressives, who were still kicking around, and the Democrats. He identified as a Republican because his early political career was with the Republican Party, being leader of the state party and state chairs of numerous Republican campaigns for president in California. In his run for governor in 1942, he cross-filed in the Republican and Democratic primaries. While he dominated the Republican primary with 94%, he received 41% in the Democratic primary against incumbent governor Colbert Olson. Olson, with his constant fighting with the Democratic Party in the Assembly, was a weak candidate, and the primary results showed it. Warren would go on to win the gubernatorial election with 57.1% of the votes. He would win re-election in 1946, repeating what he did in 1938 by winning both the Democratic and Republican primaries, winning 91% of the Republican primary and 51.9% in the Democratic primary against Robert W. Kennedy, the Democratic Attorney General, who replaced Warren once he was elected as governor in 1942. Another changing of the guard happened in 1946, as Hiram Johnson passed away while in office, with Governor Warren appointing William Nolan as his successor. Interestingly, there was a special election and a general election on the same day. The special election was to fill out Johnson's term from Election Day until the end of the term in 1947. Nolan won that election, which only had write-in candidates. The other election was the general, which Nolan also won, winning by nearly 10% over Will Rogers Jr., former congressman and son of the performer and actor Will Rogers. The 1946 election marked two significant changes in California politics. The first thing was that the issue of race was no longer front and center as it had been in the past. Even before the end of World War II, Governor Warren was publicly expressing regret for his support of internment of Japanese Americans. As far as Senator Nolan, he was appointed to the U.S. Senate just 11 days after the surrender of Japan. From what I can see, he didn't talk derogatory towards Asian Americans during his time as a U.S. Senator. Later in his Senate career, Nolan voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1957. Therefore, racism against Asian Americans, as well as Asian immigrants, basically dropped from the California political landscape. The Magnuson Act, which was signed on December 17, 1943, by President Roosevelt, repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act. It seemed as if race no longer impacted California politics. The second change was the role of business. At the beginning of this video, I rattled off the different industries that had evolved in California over the state's history. By 1946, California's economy had become so diverse that no single industry, like the railroad or oil companies, could dominate state politics. Also, the industry coming into the state was significantly more liberal when it came to issues like civil rights, as well as progressive on economic issues. One such industry was the film industry, which saw an influx of left leaning actors and actresses from the North and Midwest coming into the state. Will Rogers Jr. was one such person, as he too was an entertainer based out of Beverly Hills. Two other people who found their way to California were James Roosevelt, son of President Franklin Roosevelt, who had been working in the film industry since 1938, and the other person was Helen Gahagan Douglas, an actress who was elected to Congress in 1944 as a Democrat and was well known to have been involved in a romantic relationship with Lyndon Johnson during his time in the Congress, according to Robert Caro. Starting in 1947, conservatives started to falsely label those who were liberals as supporting or even being members of the Communist Party. One of the biggest targets for red baiting was the film industry, accusing almost the entire industry as part of a vast communist conspiracy. Because he wasn't an actor, as well as his military record and being the son of the former president, James Roosevelt never received the backlash from the Red Scare witch hunts of Joseph McCarthy. Still, Roosevelt was running against popular incumbent Earl Warren, who easily won a third term with 64.9% of the vote. This was to be his last term before he became Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. The same can't be said for Helen Gahagan Douglas. Douglas saw incumbent Senator Sheridan Downey as a do-nothing in the Senate and felt that people needed true representation. After she made her announcement that she was going to run for the U.S. Senate, she constantly attacked Downey until he said he wasn't going to run for re-election. She assumed that the ever-increasing progressive state would easily pick her policies over the presumed Republican nominee for the seat, Congressman Richard Nixon. While Nixon was considered moderate for the time, he was staunchly anti-communist. He gained national prominence as a congressman after his work on the House Un-Americans Activity Committee exposing Alger Hiss, a former worker at the State Department and a Soviet spy. Once Downey dropped out, newspaper publisher Manchester Bodie entered the race, with Bodie and his newspaper, the Los Angeles Daily, accusing Douglas of being a communist. Nixon had also cross-filed and ran in the Democratic primary. Had Bodie not run against Douglas, then Nixon could have possibly won the Democratic primary, but probably unlikely. Instead, Douglas won the primary over Bodie by over 22%. In the general election, the attacks implying ties to communism continued. Now, there is a lot that could be said in this campaign that could be an entire video itself, but for the sake of this brief history of California politics, which is already nearing 1 hour, Nixon defeated her by over 18%, basically solely based on the communism attacks against her. Her congressional seat would be taken by Democrat and California State Assemblyman Sam Yorty. Most of the 1950s were dominated by Republicans. After Earl Warren was selected for the Supreme Court, he was replaced by Goodwin Knight, a moderate Republican who would win his own term as governor in 1952. Once Richard Nixon became vice president under Dwight D. Eisenhower, Thomas Kuchel, a moderate and somewhat liberal Republican who was appointed by Earl Warren to fill out Nixon's term until a special election was held in 1954, won the special election by beating Democratic nominee Sam Yorty by nearly 8%. Kuchel would win the full term in 1956 by defeating Democratic California Senator Richard Richards by over 8%. But a national tide against Republicans, as well as a power vacuum and infighting within Republican politics, led to a Democratic sweep in 1958. During this election, the Republicans made a switch. The U.S. Senator, William Nolan, would run for governor, while the governor, Goodwin Knight, would run for the U.S. Senate. But the Republican Party was basically a mess after Warren and Nixon left the states. Nolan lost to California Attorney General Pat Brown by nearly 20%, and Goodwin Knight lost to Democratic Congressman Claire Engle by 14%. According to political scientist Taunton Anderson, who I mentioned at the start of this video, the switch and the power grab by Nolan to be governor, thus forcing Goodwin to run for senator, was a major problem for the Republicans. But I don't know. 1958 was a year in which Democrats picked up 15 Senate seats, 49 congressional seats, and 6 governor's mansions. It just seemed to be in the cards for the Democrats that year. In California, Democrats picked up the state assembly, the state senate, the attorney general, the treasurer, and the comptroller's office, with Alan Cranston winning his first public office. Pat Brown would govern as a moderate, which was not a surprise, as many prominent Democrats, such as newly elected President John F. Kennedy, were moderate as well. While all were more liberal on the issue of race, Democrats were more likely to be fiscally conservative. And since John F. Kennedy was now president, this means that Richard Nixon was not, as he lost to Kennedy in one of the closest elections in presidential history. With that, Nixon decided to run for governor of California. Former Governor Goodwin Knight was planning on running, but fell ill and decided not to make the run. This allowed Nixon to jump into the race, with opposition by Joseph Schell, the minority leader in the California Assembly. Nixon was the moderate and Schell was the conservative. Schell was supported by the John Birch Society, which falsely claimed that there was a communist cabal in control of the federal government. I do find it ironic that Nixon, who was able to win the U.S. Senate seat by labeling his opponent a communist, was now not able to get the support of the most fringe element of the anti-communist movement. But this was an important time in California's Republican politics. Nixon ended up winning the support of the California Republican Party, though not actively campaigning for it. Still, he didn't win the endorsement in a blowout and almost lost some key votes. He also advocated for members of the California Republican Party to leave the John Birch Society. While a majority of Republicans agreed with him, a significant minority didn't. Nixon would go on to win the Republican primary with 65.4% of the votes, with Schell getting 33.4%. Not only can we see these seeds of the Reagan-era conservative movement in California Republican politics, but also what led to Nixon's eventual loss as governor. Conservative Republicans were reluctant to support Nixon, with Schell only endorsing Nixon just weeks before the general election. Former Governor Earl Warren, while not endorsing any candidate, did attend events with Brown, saying that he had done a good job as governor. This was essentially all that was needed for Brown to pull off a 5% win over Nixon. After Nixon was declared a loser, Nixon alluded to the press being unfair to him and sympathetic with communists, since he said that they went after him after the Halger Hiss investigation. He closed by saying that the media didn't have Nixon to kick around anymore, and that this would be his last press conference. And yes, I'm recording this again because I had the original video in here, and the YouTube copyright bot said that Sony actually had a claim on this. I mean, what's next? Disney will claim Kennedy's inauguration speech? I mean, this is kind of getting out of hand. In the same election that Brown won, Thomas Kuchel won another term to the U.S. Senate. In the other Senate seat in 1964, former White House Press Secretary Pierre Salinger, who is now former because of the assassination of President Kennedy, decided to return to his home state of California to run for the Democratic nomination for senator. Incumbent Senator Claire Engle had a number of health problems and had to have a brain tumor removed, which led to him being removed from the Senate for 2 months. Salinger, knowing that Engle's health would probably lead to him retiring, decided to enter the race for the U.S. Senate. He was challenged in the primary by Comptroller Alan Cranston. This would essentially be a clash between national and state Democrats. The National Democratic Party, as well as President Lyndon Johnson, supported Salinger. Pat Brown also supported Salinger. One way that we know this was that when Senator Engel passed away on July 30th, 1964, Brown appointed Salinger to fill his seat, which he did a few days later. See, even though Brown was the California governor, he had always been someone who sought the national spotlight. In fact, according to White House recordings, those within the White House found Brown to be extremely annoying, always pestering the White House to do something for him. But since Brown was the governor of now the largest state in the Union, Johnson had to take his calls. Yes, Brown was annoying to the Johnson administration, but there wasn't any animosity between them. Still, Brown sided with the National Democrats in the Senate election. As for Cranston, he had the support of a number of local Democrats. Both candidates were similar on the issues, but Cranston constantly attacked Salinger for being an outsider who had not lived in California for years. He even accused Salinger of using the California Senate seat for his own national ambitions. Interestingly, 18 years later, Cranston would unsuccessfully run for president. In the Democratic primary, Salinger won 44.3% to Cranston's 39%. By the time of the Republican nomination in 1964, the right-wing element of the Republican Party, supported by Barry Goldwater and the John Birch Society, had taken over the party. This led to George Murphy, a conservative actor, being nominated as the GOP candidate. While the campaign talked about issues, much of the campaign focused on Salinger's connection to the state. Though the race was narrow, Murphy won by just over 3%. Remember, this was a landslide election for LBJ, and Murphy was the only Republican to flip a Democratic Senate seat. By 1966, Goldwater conservatism had swept into the California Republican Party. One person who gained national prominence was actor Ronald Reagan. Reagan had been a Democrat in the past and even supported Helen Gahagan Douglas for the U.S. Senate in 1950. But as time went on and Reagan started producing more films and speeches for General Electric about the threats of socialism on free markets, Reagan himself became a conservative. In the 11th hour of the 1964 presidential election, Reagan gave a speech in support of Barry Goldwater called A Time for Choosing, which received rave reviews. In fact, the speech was so good, many Republicans wondered if they could have won the presidential election had Reagan been their candidate. I talk more about Reagan's presidential climb in my video about the 1976 Republican primary. Since this was 1966 and the beginning of the anti-war movement, speeches on college campuses started popping up around California, especially at the University of California at Berkeley. Reagan charged Governor Brown with supporting the protesters and labeled them communist. He also hit Brown on higher taxes, higher spending, and running an irresponsible government. And this made sense. As I talked about in my video about Arizona politics, many of the new people entering California were well-to-do Easterners and Midwesterners who did not want to pay more in taxes. Therefore, Brown was labeled a tax and spend liberal. Brown, on the other hand, labeled Reagan as an extremist Republican. Reagan would go on to win the election with 57.6% of the vote. While he did well statewide, most of his strength came from around Orange, Los Angeles, and San Diego counties, now starting to become some of the most prominent counties nationally in the new conservative movement. It was at this point that the state was all over the place. In 1968, U.S. Senator Thomas Kuchel lost the Republican primary to Max Rafferty, a conservative Reagan-style Republican. But this time, Alan Cranston, who took another crack at the U.S. Senate, beat Rafferty by 5%. Cranston would hold the seat until 1992, when he finally decided to retire. In 1970, John Tunney, a congressman with strong ties to the Kennedy family and one of the leaders of the Draft Kennedy movement at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, defeated incumbent Senator George Murphy by more than 9%. After Pat Brown's defeat in 1966, the main face of the Democratic Party was Assembly Speaker Jesse Unruh. Unruh was quite liberal compared to most Democrats, probably being one of the most liberal politicians in the nation. This led to yet another split in the Democratic Party, with now Los Angeles Mayor Sam Yorty being the other pole. One of the biggest contentions within the Democratic Party was whether the Democrats should appeal to black voters. Another prominent person in the Democratic Party at the time was Los Angeles City Council member Tom Bradley, who was the first African American elected to the city council in 1963. Bradley decided to run against Yorty for Los Angeles mayor in 1969. At this time, Los Angeles was a majority white city, and Yorty played on the fears of white voters, saying that if Bradley were to win the race, then black nationalists would be running the city. Yorty was heavily criticized by the media and other Democrats as well. In 1966, Reagan had used race to indicate that Pat Brown had done nothing to stop the Watts riots. But this was an entirely different level. Even though Bradley easily defeated Yorty with 41.8% of the vote to Yorty's 26.1% in the first primary, there was a runoff in municipal races in California. Yorty won the runoff with 53.3% of the vote. For many, this was a shock, as Bradley had been leading in the polls up till runoff day. Political scientists would eventually call this the Bradley effect, where some white voters would tell pollsters that they were voting for Bradley so that they would give the socially desirable answer, but in fact voted for Yorty. Both men would battle again in 1973, but it was Bradley who was on top this time, winning 56.3% of the vote in the runoff election. But back to Jesse Unruh, who now decided to run against Ronald Reagan as governor. This was a pure race of liberal versus conservative, with Unruh probably being the most liberal gubernatorial candidate up to that time. As with many politicians in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Reagan presented himself as a law and order candidate, trying to win over the same voters that Yorty had been trying to win over a year before. However, Reagan was very skillful in not trying to make race an issue. Reagan also campaigned on fiscal restraints, saying that if Unruh was elected governor, taxes in California would go up. As for Unruh, he just wasn't appealing to the masses like former actor Ronald Reagan was. While Unruh made it close, he would still lose to Reagan, with the Gipper winning 52.8% of the vote. The same year that Reagan won re-election, a new, young, but not so fresh face came into the spotlight. The newly elected Secretary of State for California was Jerry Brown, the 32-year-old son of Governor Pat Brown. Jerry wasn't just young and appealing, he was smart and charismatic, something that Democratic candidates, with the exception of John Tunney, had been lacking. With his age and family connections, he looked to be the future of the Democratic Party. And while the movie The Candidate, featuring Robert Redford, was loosely based on John Tunney, the similarities between Robert Redford's character and Jerry Brown were even closer. Brown had been eyeing the governorship, and though Ronald Reagan was still eligible to run for another term, he was eyeing the presidency. Reagan decided not to run for re-election as governor in 1974. Brown jumped in with a number of other Democratic candidates. The main attacks against Brown was his age and perceived inexperience, even though he was now the Secretary of State of the largest state in the nation. Brown would run against 16 other candidates for the Democratic nomination, with Brown winning the nomination with 37.9%. The Republican candidate was State Controller Houston Flournoy, who won 63% in the Republican primary. Oh, and one thing I forgot to mention was that fusion tickets were no longer a thing, so you didn't see candidates running in both primaries anymore. Flournoy was someone distant from Reagan, being identified as a moderate Republican. However, so was Brown, as he was known for slashing wasteful spending in the Secretary of State's office. But in the end, Brown's name and charismatic personality won him the California governorship. But it wasn't just that. Watergate brought down Republicans, and the Democrats took control of the state Senate, now in control of both chambers of the state assembly. Since 1975 to the date of this recording, the Democrats have kept control of the California State Senate. As far as the state assembly, the Democrats have kept control with the exception of the 1994 Republican wave year. Also, the controller's position, which was the position that Flournoy left to run for governor, hasn't been held by a Republican since. Jesse Unruh became the treasurer and held that position until his death in 1987. And March Fung Yu, the newly elected Democratic Secretary of State, became the first Asian American to hold statewide office in California, as well as the first woman. These are the first stages of the eventual Democratic domination in the state that we see today. By this time in California politics, San Diego and Orange counties were seen as the Republican strongholds in California, with the former nativist hotbed, San Francisco, now being the Democratic and liberal capital of the state, a title it still holds today. In 1975, the city of San Francisco elected George Moscone as its mayor. Moscone was easily one of the most progressive mayors in the United States at the time. In a city that was extremely diverse, Moscone brought in people from all communities to run his city government. 3 years later, he, along with Harvey Milk, a member of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, were assassinated in City Hall. The new mayor of San Francisco would become Supervisor Dianne Feinstein. In 1976, it wasn't just Reagan that had presidential ambitions, but also Jerry Brown. Brown was a late entry into the 1976 Democratic presidential primaries, which I talk about in detail in this video here. He did win some primaries, including the California primary, but dropped out after Hubert Humphrey indicated that he would not seek the Democratic nomination. Essentially, Brown's delegates were being saved to make sure Carter didn't get the nomination, thus allowing Humphrey to challenge Carter, but that never happened. In the same year that Brown somewhat ran for president, Senator John Tunney ran for re-election to the U.S. Senate. However, his image was somewhat tarnished. In 1969, the actions of Ted Kennedy on Chappaquiddick Island in Massachusetts led to the death of Mary Jo Kopechne. It had been known that Tunney was advising Ted Kennedy on how to handle the situation publicly after the incident. This led to Tunney having a number of primary opponents, with the most prominent being Tom Hayden, a member of the Chicago Seven, leaders who protested at the DNC convention in 1968, and husband of Jane Fonda. Tunney won the primary handily, but then had to deal with Republican challenger S.I. Hayakawa, who attacked Tunney's absenteeism from the U.S. Senate. Hayakawa would beat Tunney by a little over 3%. Now, I do want to say that it's incredible seeing the shift in California politics. 30 years prior, Hayakawa wouldn't have been able to run for this position. I mean, no, really, he was a Canadian citizen living in Canada and didn't live in the United States until 1950. Still, to see a Japanese American win a U.S. Senate seat after all the discrimination that Asian Americans had to deal with in the history of California, it does feel like a good ending. But, and there's always a but, he did say that he didn't have any problems with Japanese Americans being interned during World War II. Remember, he was in Canada at the time and didn't have to be interned himself. So yeah, make of that what you will. The 1978 and 1980 elections were not exactly the most exciting. Jerry Brown won re-election as governor by nearly 20% in 1978, and Alan Cranston won re-election to the U.S. Senate also by nearly 20%. But the 1982 election would see a resurgence of the Republican Party. First, let's look at the Senate race. Jerry Brown decided to run for president in 1980, but was a minor candidate. It was quite apparent that he had more of an interest in federal politics than state politics. Therefore, he decided to run for the U.S. Senate. However, he was going to have a busy primary. He had 12 primary opponents, including writer and intellectual Gore Vidal, who most of you might know from the epic debates with William F. Buckley during the 1968 Democratic and Republican National Conventions. Brown won 50.7% of the vote in the primary, but that was low for a governor who many thought was popular. Vidal predicted that Brown would lose the election to Republican nominee Pete Wilson. Wilson, who was the mayor of San Diego, had a busier primary field than Brown. Running against Wilson was Pete McCloskey, a Republican congressman and the only person to receive a delegate vote in 1972 for the Republican nomination for president who wasn't named Nixon. Barry Goldwater Jr., who obviously was the son of Barry Goldwater Sr., Maureen Reagan, the daughter of Ronald Reagan, John G. Schmitz, the leader of the John Birch Society, Congressman Bob Dornan, as well as a host of other candidates. Oh, and before we continue, I made a pun about Bob Dornan in a previous video talking about how Loretta Sanchez defeated bombastic Bob Dornan, yet nobody got it. Dornan was a strong supporter of the B 1 bomber while in Congress, earning him the nickname B 1 Bob. So there you go. Incumbent Senator Hayakawa decided not to run for re-election. Wilson ended up winning the primary with 37.5% of the vote. When it came to both Brown and Wilson, both of them were very similar on the issues, with both being fiscally moderate and socially liberal. In fact, one of the biggest issues became Brown constantly running for president, with Wilson asking if Brown would actually complete a term as senator and not run for president. Polls did have Brown leading the field, with many in the media expecting Brown to win a close election. But in an electoral upset, not only did Wilson win, but he won by nearly 7%. Jerry Brown was out of electoral politics for now. With Brown no longer being governor, that opened up the door for a new governor. On the Republican side, Mike Curb, a music producer, was encouraged by Ronald Reagan to enter politics and was elected lieutenant governor in 1978. His main primary opponent was George Deukmejian, the Attorney General of California. Both candidates were similar on the issues, but Deukmejian was more of a law and order candidate, something that was becoming popular again in the 1980s and early 1990s. Deukmejian won the Republican primary with 51.1% of the votes. On the Democratic side, LA Mayor Tom Bradley decided to take a crack at statewide office, with his closest opponent being John Garamendi, a state senator. Bradley, with his name ID and being the mayor of the largest city in the state, won the primary with 61.1% of the vote. Interestingly, Garamendi would eventually run for Congress and is still a member of Congress at the time of this recording. Overall, the campaign was pretty civil between the two candidates, with Bradley leading in the polls approaching Election Day. However, as with his election defeat in 1969 for LA Mayor, Bradley lost a very close race to Deukmejian by only 1.1%. Many in the media said that the Bradley effect had struck again. But as a political scientist by trade, I push back against this claim. If Jerry Brown had won and Bradley lost, then yes, I think there could be an argument made for the Bradley effect. But the fact that Brown received more than 3% less than Bradley makes me think that it wasn't a polling issue only with Bradley. The polls were just wrong and had the Democrats winning. I really haven't seen any solid evidence that the Bradley effect was a real thing, especially in this race. So yeah, paint me a skeptic. During the Reagan era, the Republicans saw some success in the state. Deukmejian would win re-election in 1986 with a rematch against Tom Bradley. This time, Deukmejian won by 23%, not 1.1%. However, in the 1986 U.S. Senate race, incumbent Senator Alan Cranston, seeking his fourth term to the U.S. Senate, narrowly lost against Ed Schau by 1.5%. I sure hope I pronounced that right. 2 years later, Pete Wilson would run for re-election to the U.S. Senate, defeating Lieutenant Governor Leo T. McCarthy by nearly 9%. However, 2 years later, Wilson left the U.S. Senate to run for governor, as Deukmejian said that he would not seek re-election. During his time in the U.S. Senate, Wilson had built a reputation as being one of the most liberal Republicans, winning support from moderate Democrats. His Democratic opponent was Dianne Feinstein, who recently left the San Francisco mayor's office to run for governor. Wilson easily won his primary, while Feinstein was challenged by John Vanderkamp, the, let's all say it together now, Attorney General of California. And no, we aren't finished with that title yet. Feinstein would beat Vanderkamp by over 12%. Even though Feinstein was mayor of one of the most liberal cities in the nation, she campaigned as a moderate who was fiscally more conservative than most Democrats and supported stronger sentences for criminals, moving away from the liberal criminal rehabilitation approach and moving towards being seen as tough on crime. As for Wilson, he was basically the same. The election was close, with Wilson receiving less than 50% and only winning by 3.5%. Wilson, now governor, was able to pick his replacement to the U.S. Senate, which was Republican State Senator John Seymour from Anaheim. Ironically, the 1992 special election to fill out the rest of Wilson's term, the Democrat, Dianne Feinstein, won the election. She would stay in that U.S. Senate seat for, well, way too long. And with the 1992 election, the dam started to break. John Seymour, to date, is the last Republican to hold a U.S. Senate seat in California. Alan Cranston, who decided to retire from the Senate and not seek re-election, had his seat won by Democratic Congresswoman Barbara Boxer by nearly 5%. In the presidential race, Bill Clinton won California by over 13%, making it only the second time that a Democrat had won the state since 1952. Since 1992, no Republican has ever won the state. Oh, and Jerry Brown ran against Bill Clinton for the Democratic nomination for president and lost. More in this video here. Now, one event I didn't talk about in regards to 1992 were the LA riots, which was a result of 4 Los Angeles police officers being found not guilty in the beating of motorist Rodney King, with the incident being caught on tape. One would think that the law and order Republicans would have benefited from this, but in the end, they didn't. In polls conducted by the LA Times during the riots, all races strongly believe that the 4 officers should have been found guilty of the beating. This includes a large majority of whites. While the riots made people angry, it doesn't seem to have changed the trajectory of any elections. Even with the Democratic victories, the Republicans still had some fight left in them. Pete Wilson ran for re-election in 1994 and defeated Kathleen Brown, daughter of Pat Brown and sister of Jerry Brown, by over 14%. Brown, who had been state treasurer, ran a bad campaign, didn't raise as much money as Wilson, and didn't nearly have the charisma as her father or her brother. But remember, this was also a Republican wave year, and the Republicans did well in the states, including winning the gubernatorial race. Attorney General Dan Lundgren was reelected as Attorney General, and the GOP picked up the Secretary of State, Treasurer, and Insurance Commissioner, as well as flipping the state Senate. So the national wave did help Republicans. Republicans were also expected to pick up the U.S. Senate seat formerly held by Pete Wilson. However, Dianne Feinstein won by nearly 4%, defeating Michael Huffington. And yes, that's Arianna Huffington's husband. And while the Republicans dominated the 1994 election, there was another issue that would cause a seismic shift in California politics. Up until now, I haven't talked about Hispanic voters in California. While most Hispanics supported the Democrats, it wasn't an overwhelming amount, with Hispanic voters flipping between the two parties. But in 1994, voters voted on Proposition 187, which prevented undocumented immigrants from receiving services from the state of California. The measure passed with 58.9% of voters approving the proposition. Only 3 days later, the proposition was struck down by a federal court, and the law never went into effect. But it wasn't just the law that was the issue, but the fact that Hispanic voters felt like the law was racially targeting them. Almost overnight, Hispanic voters went from being only slightly Democratic voters to being a strong Democratic voting bloc for the foreseeable future. Pete Wilson, now seeing the writing on the wall, had a huge drop in approval rating. He would finish out the rest of his term as governor, running for president midway through his term, being one of the first candidates to drop out of the race. In 1998, Lieutenant Governor Gray Davis easily beat, let's say it all again, Attorney General Dan Lundgren by nearly 20%. Democrats also picked up the Attorney General's position, which has not been held by a Republican since, as well as the Treasurer, which also hasn't been held by a Republican since. In his campaign for re-election in 2002, Gray Davis would win a close election against Bill Simon and soon afterwards face a recall in 2003, which he would lose, which led to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger. The reason that I'm only briefly mentioning this race is because I recently released an entire video on this specific election, so go ahead and check that out. In 2006, Schwarzenegger ran for re election. As with the 2003 election, if you've already watched my video, you know that Schwarzenegger was rarely challenged on any of the issues and was able to skate by because of his celebrity status. It wasn't any different in 2006, with the governor winning by 17%. But even with Arnold's win, the Democrats continued to pick up statewide positions. Deborah Bowen was elected Secretary of State, with the Republicans not winning that office since. In Congress, Democrats took control, and San Francisco Congresswoman Nancy Pelosi would become Speaker of the House. John Garamendi became the Lieutenant Governor, with the Republicans also not winning any election for Lieutenant Governor since then. Republican Abe Maldonado was appointed Lieutenant Governor by Schwarzenegger when Garamendi was elected to Congress, but Maldonado would lose 4 years later to San Francisco Mayor Gavin Newsom. Also in 2006, another former mayor across the bay from Newsom in Oakland was elected as Attorney General. That person was Edmund G. Brown Jr. And since Jerry Brown was Attorney General, what did that mean? Of course, he had to run for governor. Schwarzenegger was term limited as governor, but might not have even won had he been able to be a candidate. When Schwarzenegger left office, his approval rating was only at 23%. Jerry Brown easily won the Democratic primary and challenged former eBay CEO Meg Whitman in the general election. Brown easily defeated Whitman by nearly 13%. In addition to Brown's win, State Assemblyman Dave Jones became the insurance commissioner, locking the Republicans out of every constitutional office. Since 2011, the Democrats have held the governorship, lieutenant governorship, secretary of state, treasurer, controller, insurance commissioner, the state assembly, and the state senate, both U.S. Senate seats, and an overwhelming majority of congressional seats, and the attorney general position. In 2010, San Francisco District Attorney Kamala Harris was elected as Attorney General, replacing Jerry Brown. With this win, Brown holds the record with the largest gap between governorships, which was 28 years. Oh, and Harris wouldn't run for governor of California yet. After Brown's 8 years as governor, Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom was elected governor in 2018. And honestly, from this point forward, the elections in California have been somewhat boring. In 2012, the state passed Proposition 14, which was a top two primary system that put all primary candidates on the same ballot, with many races leading with two Democrats running against each other. One of those elections was Kamala Harris's first run for the U.S. Senate in 2016, where she, the more progressive candidate, defeated Loretta Sanchez, who received a lot of support from Republicans. There was also the 2018 U.S. Senate race, where Kevin DeLeon challenged Dianne Feinstein, but that was almost a 10% gap, which Feinstein won. There was also Proposition 8 in 2008, which banned same-sex marriage but was deemed unconstitutional, but still showed that California might not be as socially conservative as people thought. Proposition 3 in 2024 repealed Proposition 8 with 62.6% support. And then we have the comical recall election attempt by Republicans against Gavin Newsom, which failed spectacularly with only 38.1% of voters supporting the recall. To be honest, the most interesting election in California might be the governor's race at the time of this recording. And with that, we are done with the state of California. This has been a long journey through one of the most complicated states. And while this was only a brief look at California, as one could dedicate an entire channel to the political history of California, I hope that this video helps you learn more about the history of California elections. Thank you all very much. And if you want to support the channel, please join me on Patreon with the link down below. I will see you in the next video.